Well, good evening, everybody. As we are meeting for first time this year, let me wish you Happy New Year, though rather very belatedly. And I must also tell you this is our first virtual meeting in 2021. Now, we are grateful to our distinguished eminent panel. We have, as we have just talked to Sri Ram Madhavji, we have our friend, colleague, Ambassador Sham Sharan, Professor Chintamani Mahapatra, JNU, and Professor Raja Mohanji from National University, Singapore. I am especially grateful to Professor Chintamani Mahapatra for stepping in the shoes of Don Haslin with 5 hours notice. He had to drop out that because he has been given task by State Department for an event more or less same time. But I am glad that Chintamani has been dealing with US for more than 3 decades. So this shows his knowledge and expertise and his confidence that he agreed to do us the honor in 5 hours notice. Now, we have seen a statement coming out from the newly elected president, vice president, and most recently by the Secretary of State about India-US relations. And we have every reason to believe that they are all positive statements. Especially this morning, newspapers carrying news about H4 visa for H1 visa spouses who can work in US. I'm sure it must be widely welcomed by Indian technical experts whose spouses were waiting for this in the US during Trump administration. We wish huge success to the newly elected president, vice president, secretary of state. Secretary of State, I think in his speech yesterday and during his briefings and hearing in the Congress for the confirmation, has spoken about India, and we look forward to very productive relationship under the new administration. As you recollect, since President Clinton visited India in March 2000, which was the first visit after 22 years by US president, India-US relations have been transformed beyond recognition. They have been deepened, expanded, and diversified irrespective of the change of guards in Washington and in New Delhi, and irrespective of which party came to power. This bipartisan support for warmer and closer relations with India and the presence of rich, influential, and now politically active Indian American, Indian diaspora provides a strong backbone to India's relations. It's a matter of great pride that not only the Vice President Kamala Harris, but as many as 20 young achievers selected by Biden administration for key positions is a success story. Isn't it fascinating that stirring and inspiring speech of President Biden on 20 January might have been largely scripted by an Indian American young man whose parents hailed from Telangana. Not only because India's world's largest democracy, but thanks to the size of her economy, her huge market, her defense requirements, her energy needs, her advancement in ICT, especially computer software, her economic, military, and political status as a potential counterweight to China, is quite rational and logical for the US to have close relations with India. Many congressmen, senators strongly believe that strong and developed India is in America's interest. On the other hand, India's close relations with the US not only facilitate investment and access to sophisticated cutting-edge technologies and cooperation in dozens of fields which help in fulfilling her domestic development agenda, but also help her fulfill her ambitions and aspirations to play a major role in global commons and international organizations. It also offers certain degree of protection against China's aggressive assertiveness. Differences on trade, tariff, IPR, market access, ease of doing business, localization of data, taxes on American IT companies do remain, as do different perceptions on Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iran, Russia, but these are not insurmountable. The climate change discourse, transfer of environment-friendly technologies, reform of the UN, WTO, WHO, and greater voice in the World Bank and IMF for the emerging economies, fighting against international terrorism, cybercrime, and COVID-19 offer considerable scope for cooperation between the two countries. I have just scratched the surface. I'm sure our distinguished panelists will offer various perspective of India's relations under President Biden, given the fact that his platter is full with problems both domestic and international, and the list of priorities is quite apparent. One wonders if the Biden-Harris administration will have enough time for India. Will she remain on the radar or pushed back to the background as happened in the first term of President Obama? Will it really become the defining relationship of 21st century as pronounced during President Obama? One thing is sure, if Prime Minister Modi could generate warm, bonami, friendship, personal chemistry with President Obama and President Trump, two totally contrasting personalities, there is every reason to believe that he and President Biden will hit off well and generate similar warm and personal chemistry and friendship in India and US relation and its strategic partnership and major defense partnership will grow still stronger. I will stop here and I think I will request Professor Mahapatra. Now you imagine you are not rector or vice rector at rector JNU and Professor JNU, you are sitting in the State Department, Washington. I request you to provide not an Indian perspective, an American perspective. What could have been perhaps the comment from the American CD? What do you think the Biden administration expects from India? Over to you, Professor Chintamani Mahapatra.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Kumar. Let me at the outset thank you again for giving me this great opportunity to be in the panel where very distinguished people are there. Ambassador Shyam Saran has been part of the policy-making community both in office and outside office for a long, long time. Sri Ram Madhav ji, one of the out-of-the-box thinkers that India has. Dr. Raja Mohan, Professor Raja Mohan, based in Singapore, is one of the leading intellectuals actually in Asia, and I will say even in the world, on Indian foreign policy and strategic issues. So I feel very honored. Having said that, you have already put me in Washington, D.C., and I'm looking at India from Washington, D.C. And 20 Indian Americans have already been appointed or they have been nominated by Joe Biden. I am slightly out of the 20 list, but if I think myself as an American and look at India, then how would the US look at the world and role of India in American scheme of things? Number one, first let me say a few lines about the American foreign policy priorities. That is the Joe Biden priorities. Whether it is going to be a replay of Obama administration's 8-year foreign policy, is it going to be a completely new, innovative, new grand design of Joe Biden administration towards engaging with the rest of the world? Or it is going to be something else? I think it is not going to be a replay of the Obama foreign policy. Nor is it going to be greatly innovative foreign policy. Next 4 years is going to bring results. Now, in this kind of background, North Korean long-range missiles and the cyber attack by China and Russia and the failing states in the Middle East, how he is going to think about India. So, in the second part of my observation, let me spend a few minutes on US-India relationship under Joe Biden administration. I think one of the ways to... Is it clear now?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay. Thank you very much. In the foreign policy priorities, of course, as I said, it is going to be repairing the relationship with allies and taking on the challenges from China, Russia, North Korean missiles, Chinese and Russian cyber attacks, and of course, the kind of challenges posed by the failing states in the Middle East. He's going to be terribly preoccupied with that.
Of course, his boys in the Pentagon and the State Department are going to make their own list of priorities, and they will try to engage with all the important countries around the world. But what is going to draw the attention of the White House are the few things that I said. Secondly, in this kind of background, where can we put India? Whether India is going to be of top priority or is it going to be low priority? I think it is going to be of high priority, neither top priority nor low priority. And why do I say so? You have already pointed out, Ambassador Kumar, that a lot of signaling are coming from Washington, D.C., and I think India has not been ignored. When I look back at the first 100 days of Bill Clinton presidency, and then, of course, first 100 days of Obama administration, things are so different. All difficult issues came up, and Indo-US relationship was going nowhere. But this time, so many statements have come from the White House, from the new Secretary of State, from the new Defense Secretary, which are very, very positive. Now, many people thought whether Indo-Pacific concept is going to disappear under Joe Biden. I think it is very clear now, amply clear, that Joe Biden administration is going to keep the Indo-Pacific strategy of the Trump administration. There are very few things that the Trump administration has done and Biden administration is not going to change. In the very first day, when he signed so many executive orders, and some of them were related to foreign policy, like immigration, for example, and getting back to WHO, getting back to the Paris climate deal, I don't think that he's going to have a different policy towards Indo-Pacific region. And in that, traditionally, India has been given a very important place in American scheme of things, whether it is Obama's pivot to Asia strategy or Trump's policy towards Indo-Pacific. I think that same thing is going to continue. And why is that? That is because the most critical challenge to the US is going to come from China. Of course, Joe Biden will give priority to what is happening in the Western Hemisphere. The Chinese influence, the Chinese footprint is going stronger by the day. But next in the line would be Indo-Pacific. And that is why India's role is going to be very critical. And when Anthony Blinken, during his hearing, he talks about Indo-Pacific and India's role, and he says that the US would not allow any country, including China, to challenge the sovereignties of friends and partners like India. That is a very, very big message. And when Lloyd Austin talks to Rajnath Singh Ji and talks about the Indo-Pacific dream, Indo-Pacific scheme, that is another signaling that Indo-US relationship is going to be of high priority under this administration. However, does it mean that things are going to be hunky-dory as it was before? No, actually things have never been hunky-dory. There have been challenges, there have been ups and downs, even when we're trying to build up a strategic partnership over the last 2 decades. So what are going to be the real difficulties? Number one, Joe Biden has not made it very clear yet what kind of policy he is going to adopt towards Afghanistan. Now, in Afghanistan, India played a soft role, and that was in keeping with the American interest. Of course, Joe Biden is also going to withdraw the troops. I mean, at least slow down it. But what kind of policy is going to adopt and whether India is going to be part of the decision making or not, we don't know yet. That is going to be a critical challenge because Taliban coming back to power will raise a different kind of issues altogether, and that will be a bigger challenge to India than to Pakistan. And number two, as far as China is concerned, of course, it's going to have a robust policy towards China. The rhetoric is going to be milder than what Trump used. And of course, the sentences are going to be less provocative towards Taiwan and all. Even on Hong Kong and Xinjiang, they will talk about human rights but do nothing. But if Joe Biden administration thinks that he is going to be having a more cooperative tie with China, then we have to think very seriously about it for whatever is happening along the LAC. Trump administration gave not only signals, but also took certain steps which were beneficial to India. For example, selling the ships in South China Sea, holding naval exercises with India. So whether Joe Biden is going to have that kind of relationship or not, of course, I would say that everything doesn't depend on what's going to happen in Washington, D.C. Part of the ball will be in Delhi's court. How we adopt the approach towards China is going to be equally important. Finally, because of the shortage of time, you have given me only 10 minutes. Finally, there are issues which are bilateral in nature, whether it is economy or trade, or whether it is education collaboration, or collaboration in technology. These are the details. The devil is there in the details. There will be differences. Of course, the Joe Biden administration is going to try to open up India as much as possible to American investment and American export. And we ourselves will have our own priorities. So Atmanirbhar Bharat this side and America first that side, there may be a collision at different areas. And secondly, as far the education sector is concerned, I think the future is going to be bright because this Confucius institutes in the USA have earned a very bad name. The American government has not only asked the Chinese students to leave, they're going to close down the Confucius institutes. When the government of India, under the new education policy, is asking the Institute of Excellence to open campuses abroad, the US is the next target. And there are people who think that IISc in Bangalore and IITs are going to try to open campuses even in the place where the MIT is there. So that sector is going to be really bright. Finally, my last point is this. Should we be really happy about the fact that a vice president is of Indian origin, that 20 people have occupied key positions in the Joe Biden administration? Here, I'll just give one-liner saying they're all Americans who will be devoted to promoting American interest.
Okay.
Ambassador Kumar.
Thank you, Professor. For 5 hours notice, you have done a great job. Now I turn to Sri Ram Madhavji. Ram Madhavji, I had seen you when Prime Minister Modi visited USA first time September 2014. You were everywhere on all the press conferences, and you have seen how Prime Minister Modi has developed that personal rapport, bonami, chemistry with two different presidents. You remember Prime Minister Modi came to White House in his white kurta, churidar, and black jacket and black sandals, sat there without eating, performing his Navratra fast, and then the great hug. And President Obama became the first president to come to India twice and to become the chief guest at the Republic Day Parade. And if you remember Hyderabad House at the Man Ki Baat Chai Par Charcha, I think Prime Minister addressed President Obama by first name more than 10 times. Then you saw President Trump. You saw the hug and you saw Howdy Modi and you saw Motera. And you can see now one will take for granted that this Jadoo Ki Jhappi, which does wonders, will be equally effective with President Biden. Only question is with the COVID-19, real Jhappi may not be possible. So do you think the virtual Jhappi will be as effective as the real Jhappi? But before really this lighter vein, I think everybody knows Ram Madhavji, but for the sake of my sort of protocolar courtesy, I must mention a few lines. Sri Ram Madhavji has been National General Secretary Bharatiya Janata Party. He has been associated with RSS since 1981 and was a member of the National Executive Committee of RSS and its national spokesperson since 2003 till 2014. He has worked as journalist for 20 years with RSS-sponsored publication and authored about a dozen books. His latest book, Uneasy Neighbors, India and China After 50 Years of War, has been widely talked about. He serves as a member of the Board of Governors of India Foundation, a New Delhi-based think tank focused on the issues, challenges, opportunities of the Indian polity. He is also a mentor of Vision India Foundation, a New Delhi-based think tank working on publication leadership amongst youth. Ramadi, my request is you might kindly say what are our expectations from this administration? Do we have concerns about some earlier statement when President Biden was not president and Kamala Harris was not vice president? There was some statement attributed to them regarding J&K or maybe CA or NCR or minority religious communities, those issues which have been reported in press. Do you think these were all the things to pass during campaign? People say many things. Once you are in the office, you really look at issues totally different perspective. So over to you. Have seen now you have seen the third president since Prime Minister Modi came to power, and we hopefully relations will go from strength to strength. Over to you.
Thank you, Ambassador Surendra Kumarji. My namaskars to everybody. I'm not a diplomat. I don't have any diplomatic background, so I approach it from a purely political perspective. I really do not see any big changes happening between India and USA in our bilateral relationship, because I always believed that this relationship stood on a very strong bipartisan consensus, very strong interests propel this relationship. So I really don't see any great change happening because of the change of leadership in the US. But I must admit here that I was one of the very few on my party side to sigh a great relief when finally the results came and President Biden made it to become the president. Uh, Not because I was an admirer of Democrats, nor because I had anything against the Republicans. But my main issue was that the world was not ready for the kind of tectonic shift that President Trump wanted to bring in America's foreign policy, the way he wanted America to withdraw from everywhere. It's finally their choice, but the world was not ready for that kind of sudden situation. Uh, so I felt that America has always had a role to play, an important role to play, so that many countries in the world can also benefit from the presence of America in an important position in a number of international or multilateral institutions, global institutions. Uh, in that sense, President Biden's taking over, as far as India is concerned, number one, of course, as far as the bilateral issues are concerned, even Professor Mahapatra has talked about it. I don't, as I mentioned, I don't think it's going to be a very serious issue for us all to really worry about and start, breaking our heads. It will continue to be smooth. I sincerely believe that way. And as you also initially mentioned, this H-1B visas issue and all these issues are actually a good thing for us. But for India, we have to see this relationship from two important prisms. One is the China challenge prism. Second is the American opportunity in our neighborhood. These two prisms, we have to see this relationship. I think as far as the China challenge prism is concerned, it's not just about defense or military or Chinese Navy or Chinese trade even. It is much bigger than that. Building of a completely new world order. That is the attempt of China right now. So there, how do we take advantage of a friendly America? In that, President Biden's initial call for a democratic conclave of world democracies, should be really seized upon by us, because incidentally today, if you want to challenge China in terms of its technological prowess, in terms of its economic strength, in terms of its own strategic approach to its relations with the world, it is important that democracies in the world should come together. Democratic countries in the world have technological power, they have financial power, they are important countries, whether it's Japan, Australia, some of the European nations, America, India, we all have to come together and work together. So on technology, on climate change, these are the issues that are going to be on the high table in global diplomacy. In all these issues, the real challenge comes from China. In order to tackle that challenge, we need this whole, proposition of Biden that democracies should come together and work together should certainly be seized upon by us. Secondly, I would like to make two propositions. Number one, to the west of our geography, in the Arab world, what President Biden will do needs to be watched closely. What America will do, will it pursue the same policies of President Trump, unlikely, but how he will deal with the non-Arab bloc, non-Arab arc rather, from Pakistan to Turkey via Iran, Iraq, and Syria. This bloc, which is emerging as a strong non-Arab bloc, how does Biden administration want to deal with it is something that we have to watch closely. Arab world is close with the American dispensation. Incidentally, they have become close with our leadership also. The second issue will be to our east, to the east of our geography, the Indo-Pacific. There I have been insisting that India should put forth the proposition, which nowadays even the American leaders are gradually acknowledging, that the regional powers should be in the forefront. America and other European nations should be in the supportive role in managing the affairs in the Indo-Pacific region. It's not about just open and transparent Indo-Pacific, it should be inclusive. So to that extent, to the east of our geography, we should try and convince the American leadership to allow regional powers to take the lead. The final point that I want to make here is as far as the bilateral relationship is concerned, or rather in achieving all these things, we sometimes put unrealistic expectations from people with Indian origin that are in the administration there. We want them to behave like Indians, or probably like BJP people. My party's expectation is that Kamala Harris should be a staunch temple-going Hindu wearing tilak every day. It doesn't work that way, as Professor Mahapatra rightly pointed out. I mean, it's not just about the leaders. I deal with second-generation Indians in America. They're more American than Indian. We must realize that this unrealistic expectation should not be there. While there is an Indian there is a resonance, there is a connectivity, you can always exploit that, but we should deal with all of them as American leadership, American diplomats, and we have to deal with them in that sense only. One small point, yes, there will be a few irritants likely, because Democrats are different from Republicans. They have got certain principles. Republicans have got certain different principles. Of course, Trump was an exception. Trump basically did not have any principles. He only had transactionalism. Democrats have different principles. They might raise issues of human rights. They might raise issues like Kashmir and all. I always tell our people that in politics, if somebody somebody criticizes you, you fight with him. You argue with him. But in diplomacy, you have to reach out, convince them about the efficacy of your stand, and win them over. I think that is going to be the major challenge for India's foreign policy establishment. Ambassador, I will stop here. Thank you and namaskar.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ram Madhavji. I now turn to Professor Raja Mohan, sitting in Singapore Vantage location. You have heard Ram Madhavji that we must try to convince those who don't agree with us with our arguments. Now tell us, sitting in Singapore, how things look from there. Do you think President Biden will continue to have that aggressive anti-China stand? Do you think he will be as aggressive on Indo-Pacific and Quad? If you remember, when Vice President Biden came to India in 2013, that time it was not Indo-Pacific, it used to be called Asian Pacific. An interview to Times of India, Vice President Biden has said in India itself that both China and India are important members of Asia Pacific. Now we have Indo-Pacific, we have Quad, we have seen so many articles coming in newspapers talking about how these two organizations can be forums for really containing or pressurizing China to behave according to international laws. Now, American stand on these two issues will certainly impact India. Besides, you can also comment on what is going to happen in Afghanistan, what is going to happen in Iran. They have already, I see, made some noises. If Iran come back to the full compliance, then they can reopen the possibility of going back to the JCPO. But on Russia, you have seen President Biden has already called Putin, talked to him. But at the same time, they have not avoided really criticizing all those arrests and the demonstrations which are taking place in Moscow. And in China, I think new Secretary of State has already called a genocide what is happening in Xinjiang province. So you have a lot of things to comment upon. You are most welcome to comment on the previous two speakers also. Over to you, Professor Raja Mohan.
Thank you, Ambassador Kumar. Thank you for inviting me to join this very distinguished panel, many of whom I've worked with in the past. So let me just stick to 5 points because American presidents deal with the whole world, but I think we can discuss anything in the world when we're thinking about the U.S. Policy. So I'll just stick to five aspects which are of consequence for India. First is an administration in the end is people, the people who staff the critical positions. From what we've seen so far, most of the key appointments are people that have worked with India before, at least from the time of Ambassador Shamsaran when he was the Foreign Secretary. He was negotiating the nuclear deal, whether it is Bill Burns, who's now director of CIA, Anthony Blinken, or Kurt Campbell, Jake Sullivan, many of these people. And I think at the next level, let's not focus on the Indians, but look at the functional positions across the board. Many of them are familiar to Delhi, and there will be a level of comfort. So I think that will be a big important factor. The second, of course, the people might be familiar, but the circumstances are very different. And what distinguishes the administration of Biden from the predecessors is the explicit formulation that the US foreign policy will be guided by the interests of the middle class, American middle class. So this is actually a response to multiple domestic crises that have afflicted the United States on the economic front and a whole range of issues that there is an acceptance of Trump's criticism that the American foreign policy elite had veered away too much from the interests of its people. Therefore, the foreign policy must be connected to America's domestic interests. And I think that's the new formulation. And I think that is something we got to pay attention. And within that, I think the idea of a new foreign policy that works for the middle class, it is you can break it up into at least 3 or 4 issues that I'll highlight. One is the question of China, because whether it is the American economic security is deeply tied to the question of trade with China and the kind of competition that China has provided to the United States. So therefore, this idea is not just for us being pleased with the use of the word Indo-Pacific. What we've seen so far and what we heard during the campaign, that the contradiction between the interests of the US and Beijing, and China, are structural. And those structural contradictions are not going to simply disappear just because we've had an election. But within that, there are multiple groups in the US which seek different ways of engaging China. The tone will certainly change, but the contradiction between the two systems has deepened, and I think there's no way of getting around it. But as we said, look, there are ways in which the policy will be contested by different people on different issues, but we've seen a signaling that the China policy will continue, and as part of that, the Indo-Pacific framing has largely continued so far in the articulation of the administration. On Afghanistan, which is the second next point, the third point I want to talk about, which is really, I think they've announced a review of the agreement that was done by Trump last year. Zalmay Khalilzad, what he had negotiated, there's some speculation he might stay on. So the question of gender, the question of rights of people, that is being raised. But my own assessment, as opposed to what is being said in Washington, is there is very little political support for a continued engagement of a prolonged high-level military commitment to Afghanistan. Indians would love to have Americans fight till the last American, but that's not going to happen. So I think one way or another, the US retrenchment, I think, in Afghanistan, after 2 decades of occupation, more than $1 trillion and thousands of Americans injured. So there's going to be no way this war is going to continue in the same form. So in some sense, the point that Mr. Ram Madhav was making, the regional powers, whether anybody wants it or not, are going to play a larger role in Afghanistan and the dynamic that is going to develop there. And I think we should be prepared for it. The other issues in our Western frontiers, so for example, on Iran, the first call Blinken made was to Israel, actually, probably to convince them, look, the differences over Iran deal, but whatever it is, they've imposed a pause on the arms sales to Saudi Arabia and UAE, all in the last 48 hours. But my sense is that, look, the Israeli factor will continue to shape significantly. And Yesterday, Blinken said, look, when he was asked, how soon are you going to join the nuclear deal with Iran? He said, look, there's still some distance, quite a bit of distance to go. So they will demand fresh conditions from Iran, and Iran is not going to accept it. So the problem is likely to remain. But overall, I would say we must expect some retrenchment of American role in the Middle East as a whole, because 2 decades of war there has, now there is actually across the aisle opposition to what is being called endless wars in the Middle East. So that's going to happen. The third, I think the most important issue beyond the political is the question of trade. On trade, there is some signal of continuity here, surprisingly, though Biden denounced Trump's trade policies, that he's almost talking the same language of America first. Some of the announcements that were made yesterday, make in America, buy American, sounds very much like Atmanirbhar America. But of course, they come to it from a very, very different point of view. But I think he's also said during the campaign, there would be no new trade deals signed, and it will be pretty hard for them to actually get congressional support because the fast track authority will expire in the summer of this year. So I don't see any, in the near term, the problem of relating trade policy to domestic economic interests of the middle class. That is the key concern. And I think it will take some time before they come up with something. But basically, I think it opens a small door for India that having walked out of the RCEP, India needs to clinch, having done a lot of negotiation with the Trump administration, some kind of a trade agreement with the US at this point would be sensible because we can't be completely out of trade agreements with everyone. So my sense is that is a priority for India of at least begin to work together on a bilateral trade deal as well as a joint program for reforming the WTO, because it's not that the Biden administration is simply going to go back and say WTO is great. That's what the rich capitalists in America want, but Biden can't say it, even if he wants it. So I think there will be talk of reform. And I think India, instead of saying we are always bound by WTO rules, should be saying, how do we reform the WTO system? Because partly, it is not acceptable to a large number of Americans. Secondly, the Chinese have gamed the system. So change is inevitable in how the WTO is going to function. And I think we should be prepared for the change. The fifth point, which I wanted to talk about, is climate change. And I'm sure Ambassador Shyam Saran is going to touch on that. Biden announced yesterday, last night, that there will be a climate change summit on April 22nd in Washington. Everyone was expecting a democracy summit, but I think they've changed course. With the climate change has become the big objective, the appointment of Kerry, the decision to make this a comprehensive government-wide approach to climate security. He's also ordering the Pentagon to decide what are the long-term climate risks. So I think this is going to be, if there's one signature initiative from Washington under Biden, it is about climate change. And I'm not sure we are fully prepared for this, but I think my view, I'm sure Ambassador Shyam Saran has done the negotiations. He might have something really more concrete to say, but my sense is this is no longer about the first principles of climate change. This is no longer about common but differentiated responsibility. This is no longer about who did historically what in relation to climate change. My sense is already you see, it's not just what the administration does. BlackRock, one of the top investment firms in the US, is saying green finance is going to be part of the overall decision making, and not just in relation to what projects they support. If you're an insurance company wanting to build a new housing in Florida in the Everglades, how much of climate risk is there for the longevity of this project? What are the kind of issues that we're going to confront? So I think we're going to see a fundamental restructuring of the economic energy basis of modern industrial economies, which is we've used one type of energy without reference to its costs and consequences. But today, that structure of energy use is going to be changed radically. And this problem will require, I think, a whole new approach from India. And my own sense is the current crisis where Biden has talked about 2050 for net zero emissions. Xi Jinping has been clever. He said before 2060. And our own Prime Minister has said in one of his speeches, 2047, some kind of an ambition for India to be able to do something significant. So I think if there is one area where India is going to do some real negotiations with the Americans immediately, that's going to be on climate change. That's also the first opportunity to really to explore the common ground. I'll just conclude by saying that in all these areas, there is room for engagement for us, that we start on a good point. We know the people, the context we are quite familiar. And I think for India, there is extraordinary room here to on trade, on climate change, on Indo-Pacific. And I would support what Mr. Ramadov said, which is really, look, this is going to be about burden sharing. The US cannot do for the next 20 years what it has done for the last 70 years, but they would do the heavy lifting of securing Asia, whether it is the Middle East or whether it is the Indo-Pacific. So we should be prepared to take more responsibilities. And if we take more responsibilities, a whole different framework will emerge for constructing a new framework of cooperation, because India is not going to be an ally. It is a framing of how do we take additional responsibilities and how do we coordinate that with the US becomes the, or the Quad or the other partners is going to be the challenge. So good moment for India to think afresh some of its own policies and be open and be prepared for a substantive and intensive negotiation on Indo-Pacific, on trade and on climate change.
Thank you, Professor Raja Mohan. Now, Shyam, over to you. You don't need any introduction. Everybody knows. You have been Foreign Secretary. You were Chairman of National Security Advisory Board. You were Chairman of RIS. You are now with Distinguished Fellow CPR. And you were handling environment as Prime Minister's Special Envoy. I don't see many faces. Now, Shyam, Raja Mohan has ended on saying this is a right moment, signature initiative, climate change, and we have really scope to negotiate others. You can comment on all other previous speakers also, but I will also like, you have spent years, your lifetime in studying China. Do you really see some possibility of some kind of talk between the US and China? The strident trade policy, tariff war started by Trump might not go away because they want to balance the trade, but certainly the style of really rhetoric might be toned down. Secondly, do you think that Trump, you remember during the presidential debate, he said, air in Delhi is filthy. And what Biden said, this is not how we speak about friends. He did not say that air in Delhi is not filthy. He simply said, this is not how you talk about friends. Is there going to be change in the substance, or is it just only change of the way, the manner and style you really convey your disagreement? Over to you.
Thank you very much, Surinder, for inviting me to this interaction.
You had some tough moments with John Kerry during your earlier incarnation.
Yes, in fact, on the issue of climate change. So I will come to that because I think that's, as Raja Mohan said, that is going to be a very important item on the agenda of our relations. So let me begin by saying that, yes, of course, every new president comes with a different style, perhaps comes with a different kind of perspective, and has his own agenda. So we should expect Biden to also come with his own agenda. What I would like to mention here, though, is that the good news is that even during the 4 years of Trump, with respect to some very key components of our relationship, not only was there continuity, but there was also consolidation. Whether we are looking at, say, counterterrorism, or we are looking at the Indo-Pacific strategy, the defense relationship, we have signed the 3 foundational agreements. The defense hardware relationship is very sound, it is expanding. So what I would like to first mention is that even though in other respects, the Trump presidency was seen as a disruptive kind of a period, certainly with respect to many allies as well as adversaries. It was rather disruptive. He was an unpredictable president, unpredictable even as far as India is concerned. Certainly on, for example, some issues relating to trade. You saw that he offered to mediate between India and Pakistan. He also offered to mediate between India and
India, China also.
I think it was a disruptive period, but I think the good news is that what may be regarded as the kind of permanent establishment of the United States, what people call the deep state in a sense, that particular institutional stability of the United States ensured that those aspects of our relationship where there is a strong convergence. So, as I mentioned, the defense relationship, the counter-terrorism relationship, the Indo-Pacific relationship, these are in very sound order. And I would imagine that under a team that Biden has assembled, and as Raja Mohan said, several of these people are very familiar to us. We have dealt with them in the past, dealt with them very, very intensively. If you take, say, Bill Burns, he was a very important interlocutor when we were negotiating the Indo-US nuclear deal. So these are people who are familiar with India. And also, these are people that India is very familiar with. So I would expect that whatever may be the other aspects of our relations, those important areas where we have already had strong convergence, those will continue to not only be further consolidated, but I think they will expand further under this administration. So that's in a sense the good news. Now, as far as relationship with China is concerned, I know that people perhaps look at, is there something wrong with the screen?
No, please go ahead.
As far as China is concerned, I think I would hope that we do not look at the India-US relationship purely from the prism of our relations with China. I think that's a very natural sort of a reaction, considering the kind of very challenging environment which we face today. But there is much more to Indo-US relations than merely the common interest that both of us have, particularly as democracies, to have some kind of a strong countervailing presence to China. That is certainly an important component. But I would say that for India, and from the Indian perspective, I think it is important to look at the relationship with the US from also different perspectives. One is the United States of America continues to be the knowledge capital of the world. It continues to be the source of cutting edge technologies, whichever area that you're looking at. 4 or 5 of the most important high-tech companies in the world are American. And their combined turnover is something like $5 trillion, which is much more than many countries, including India. Yeah. So I think we should look at our relationship and partnership with the United States as a relationship which can be very, very important and significant in supporting India's own developmental objectives. Because if we are looking to the future, which is the country which can help us most in terms of our developmental objectives, I think it is the United States of America, it is Japan, it is Western Europe. These are the most advanced economies in the world. And I think we should tap our relationship, good partnership that we have with them, political relations we have with them, to be able to leverage that to really help us with our developmental objectives. So we should not look only at the China factor. And the third element, of course, is that even though there may be some concerns about what may be happening in India, we are the world's largest democracy. And I would hope that we would look at our relationship with the United States, the oldest democracy in the world, challenged perhaps, as we have seen, just as we have been challenged. But I think it is in our common interest to really look at that affinity that we have in terms of being democracies to further strengthen our relationship And there, the Biden administration is perhaps going to be much more sort of focused on the political values, on human rights, than perhaps the previous administration. So rather than looking at that as somehow creating some problem for us, like many people have been thinking that maybe there will be a greater focus on some of these issues under Biden, I think we should perhaps look at this orientation of Biden as actually an opportunity where we can actually, strengthen the democratic bonds between the two countries. So that's the other part. Now, we should also be clear that while I agree with Raja Mohan that the confrontation between US and China is in fact structural in character and is likely to continue under Biden. I do not think that there is any doubt about that. But I would say that the manner in which that relationship is handled by the US, that I anticipate will change. Because if I see, for example, John Kerry talking about how important climate change is, in terms of US international objectives. And he also has said, you cannot deal with the climate change challenge unless you have China on board, unless you engage with China. So if that is the case, that is the entry point to re-engagement with China at a high level. So I do anticipate that under Biden, after the initial, sort of a little bit of hedging, a little bit of, muscling, I do expect that there will be a resumption of high-level engagement between the US and China. That is certainly in US interest. And our reaction should not be one of alarm, that somehow or the other, this means that we are in deep trouble. We are not, precisely because of the structural factor, that the need for the United States to work together with other major countries in order to deal with the China challenge will not change, but the manner in which it is pursued perhaps will change, and we should be ready for that and not regard that as somehow narrowing our room for maneuver. So that's one point that I would make. The other aspect which I think is very important is the economic issue. I have always said that the weakest link in terms of our relationship is the almost adversarial kind of a situation that we have had for a long time on the economic and trade issue. And my answer is not so much that we should be looking for a trade agreement with the United States, because I believe that is going to be very difficult. But, if you take the example of the Indo-US nuclear deal, it was perhaps a much more fraught, much more complex, much more difficult legacy issue for us to resolve than the trade issue. We do not have that kind of a difficult, complex kind of a situation that we faced when we were dealing with the nuclear deal. Why is it not possible for us to bring the same level of commitment, the same level of engagement to really resolving the economic and trade issues? Because I also believe that there are great opportunities with respect to the trade and economic relationship. Our trade actually is expanding despite all these problems. US investment in India is expanding. So if you look at the ground situation, actually it is quite good. So let us try and really address this issue with the same energy and commitment as we did with the nuclear issue. And I believe that is also something which would really help India in terms of its own development objectives. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Shyam. You have covered all the points raised by others. Now, in the last 5 years, the success story of India-US relations has been the defense sector. Everybody knows they have touched, I think, $20 billion worth of defense export from the US. And we have a major defense partner, STA, one status, and all these foundation communication agreements have been signed. Now, we are fortunate to have amongst us the former Chief of Army Staff General Deepak Kapoor. The General Kapoor want to ask something on defense sector. General Kapoor.
Thank you, Ambassador Kumar. Uh, Very heartening to hear some of the very eminent panelists today. I'm going to be a little more specific, and that is to do with India's future growth and development in the region, as well as the aspect of national security. We are all aware that we are going through problems on the Indo-China border all along the line of actual control. Now, and we are also aware that the Chinese do possess a much greater military muscle compared to ours, and that is evidenced by the fact that they have been spending almost about 4 times, and that is the official figure, than us on their defense for the last 2 decades, and perhaps even more. That notwithstanding, while we have taken a good stance in places like East Ladakh and we are holding our own, the aspect from a national security and territorial integrity perspective is that, firstly, there are two aspects which matter. Firstly, we have a very close relationship with the Soviet Union as well. And we have a lot of equipment in terms of tanks, aircraft, submarines, etc., having come from there, and therefore they are also our close partners. So when you look at the US foreign policy, it has to weigh in that we would like to continue with both these powers at an even keel. And the second aspect related to that is the fact that in the uh, attempt to have a foreign policy which is totally its own autonomous, then we need to also weigh whether to what extent would the US be prepared to go and assist us if a push comes to shove as far as Sino-Indian confrontation is concerned. And my question is to the panel, to the extent that let's have a little specific view on this aspect. I know Ambassador Sham Saran covered this aspect to some extent, but I'm afraid when we have a confrontation on, we look at a specific issue and how will the US foreign policy pan out when push comes to shove. Thank you.
Sham, would you like to make comment?
Yeah, okay. I have, stated before that we can certainly expect considerable support from the United States, whether it is in terms of, weaponry or technology, even intelligence sharing. I believe that, in fact, intelligence sharing has been taking place during this standoff with China on the border. But I would still maintain that we will not get the United States or any other friend to actually come and fight our battles on the borders. So this is a challenge which we will have to deal with ourselves. And we should be prepared to do that. Now, that does not mean that we have to, I hate to sort of say this before a very distinguished general, but I would perhaps risk making this point that it is not necessary, to my mind, to match the Chinese, weapon for weapon or troop for troop. I do believe that what we need to be able to do is to make certain that we have enough capabilities deployed on our borders, which makes it very risky and costly for China to try and engage in any kind of provocative or aggressive action. I think there should be a clear understanding on the Chinese side that there will be a cost to pay if such provocative action is taken. Beyond that, I think if we are able to assemble together with countries like the United States, Japan, Australia, and others, we are able to construct a fairly strong kind of a countervailing grouping to China that will certainly play a role. But at the end of the day, on the borders, I believe that is something that we have to deal with ourselves.
Madhav, you would like to add something?
Not really. I only agree with Ambassador Shyam Saran that more than parity, we should focus on building capability. Any adventure or misadventure from that side should be costly for them. That should be the approach, I believe. I totally agree with Ambassador Shyam Saran.
Okay, I see the national editor of the Hindu, Suhasini Haidar. Suhasini, you have a question.
I'm not sure if this has been dealt with because please forgive me, I had to go away for about 5 minutes. But the outgoing US ambassador to India, Kenneth Juster, made a point. He was asked about the possibility of sanctions under S-400, under CATSA for our purchase of the S-400. And his point was, please look at this in a larger sphere. The idea that India can continue to buy what he called the a la carte option. I will take one piece of equipment from here and one piece of equipment from there. He said that's going away. Eventually, interoperability and the kind of concerns, the security concerns that countries have are going to mean that you cannot have one Russian platform, you cannot have another American platform, and expect that you will continue to get high tech from America on, while also purchasing from rival countries. So I wanted to know if Ambassador Saran, Mr. Ram Madhav, Chintamani, if you'd like to just weigh in on where you see this part of the relationship going. Yesterday in that conversation with Lloyd Austin, Raksha Mantri had also spoken about the necessity to get high-tech cooperation increased. And there is a general sense that while the US has opened up a lot on defense equipment, on high-tech cooperation, there is still a lot of, despite all the foundational agreements being signed, there is still some hesitation. So one part of the question that I wanted to ask is, do you see CATSA sanctions happening? What kind of sanctions will they be? Does it matter to India? Will any kind of sanction be a problem, or are certain sanctions something India can learn to live with and move on in the relationship? And the second part is, do you see greater and greater pressure for India to actually abandon all other platforms? Not simply because America is saying so, but because America is making other purchases contingent on this.
I think I will request all the 4 panelists to comment. You start with Shyam, then we go to Ram
and Raja Mohanji as well.
And Raja Mohanji and Chintamani Mahapatra. Shyam, over to you.
Let me put it this way. We have faced this problem earlier, even during the time when we had been developing this very strong defense relationship that I talked about before. And what is the argument which we used with the US? The argument which we used with the US was that, you have to understand that we have to deal with what is a legacy of very strong defense partnership with the then Soviet Union and then Russia, precisely because our access to high technology items and some sensitive technologies was not available to us from other sources. By the way, as you, I think, were hinting, there are still areas of high technology where we do not have full access in the case of our defense relationship with the United States. So I think we should be engaged with the United States, and I think we should use that argument that this is something which you will need a certain time period, you will need a certain evolution in the relationship for us to be able to consider whether or not we can really do only with one source of supply. Now, will the US accept that argument? I think the US should accept that argument. Of course, I can't predict, I'm not an astrologer, but I would say that considering the fact that if you look at how far Indo-US defense relationship has progressed over the last 10 to 15 years. You know, when I was foreign secretary and we signed the defense cooperation framework agreement, if anybody had told me that within a decade or so, our our defense relationship, hardware relationship will be something like $20 billion, I would say that you are mad. So if you look at where we started off from and where we have reached, the fact that we have also, despite considerable amount of political price that has had to be paid, we have signed the 3 foundational agreements with the United States. If you look at what has been happening with respect to the Indo-Pacific strategy, why should the United States of America, in fact, put all that at risk? By sort of making the S-400 issue a major point of difference between the two countries. If the United States of America and the professionals who are currently in the Biden team, if they are looking at this in a professional manner, and from really the standpoint of the importance of taking India-US strategic partnership forward, I would think that there should not be any issue of sanctions on India on the S-400 issue. Thank you.
Ram Madhavji.
We have faced these kind of threats from the previous dispensation also of sanctions. Of course, sanctions must be avoided. There should not be any sanctions against India by the US. To that extent, government should proactively talk to the new administration also. In the old administration, a lot of negotiations happened. Finally, I believed that we succeeded in convincing them that it's a one-time affair. We have purchased some 4-5 S-400 systems, but then we also have offered major defense dome for capital to the Americans at a much higher cost. So because the previous dispensation, as I said, was more transactional, so to pass them on S-400s, you have offered them something more expensive that we get from America. But I agree with Suhasini that yes, this probably will come back to bother us for some time, but I'm sure we must do everything possible to avoid any kind of sanctions. There I probably fully agree with Ambassador Shamsar, and also America would weigh a lot before imposing any sanctions on India, because at least in the Indo-Pacific future, America definitely needs India on its side. I mean, it's actually something that the interests of both the countries are involved. So I sincerely hope that it will not go to the extent of sanctions, but nevertheless, we must try to ensure that no such situation arises. Thank you.
Professor Raja Mohan.
I think it's less about S-400 itself and the Kratza sanctions, but I think the US-Russia relationship and the India-Russia relationship are running, there is a friction. That friction had started some time ago, and I think that friction will continue. Of course, if you're an optimist, you might think there might be an improvement in US-Russia relationship, but at this point, that doesn't look too likely. So that brings us to the friction is likely to continue. Second, that because sanctions could be imposed does not mean sanctions would be imposed. The American system is beautifully designed, so there's always exemptions. The president can do it, the Congress can do it. So it's a political judgment in the end. It's not a juridical decision of where the US-Russia relationship and India-US relationship evolve. That's how it's going to be managed. And I think we managed far more complicated relationships, complicated issues before. So I don't think we should be too worried that somehow this is the thin end of the wedge that's going to undermine the whole relationship. And finally, is there a country that has not been sanctioned by the United States?
Professor Chintamani.
Yeah. The US has already imposed sanctions against Turkey. Turkey is a member of NATO. So that is why the question whether they're going to impose it on India, it has been on the table for quite some time. So the question is quite valid. Now, if I talk to the Americans, I'll say the following. Number one, Russia is not the former Soviet Union. And number two, India is a big arms bazaar even for the Americans, right? And number three, these S-400 are never going to be used against the United States. Number five, this is only to strengthen Indian defense. So I would rather argue with them that given the size of the market that you have in India, and Russia not being the former Soviet Union, no ideological competition or any competition of that kind, you should consider India in that context. And then I would also argue with the Indian side. I would argue that Russia is an important country. It is a strategic partner. This strategic partner is very relevant in the present context. At the time of Sino-Indian tension along the border, it is very, very useful. And the kind of relationship Russia has with China, keeping a good relationship with Russia is equally important for us. So that is why we should try to convince the Americans the need of not to sanction right now. And finally, a little bit of astrology, that because of what's happening along the LAC, number one, and number two, because there is also on the table, putting some sanctions against Iran, I don't think Joe Biden at this moment, having a deep economic crisis at home, reaching out to other countries for trade and other benefits, are going to use sanctions as a tool against India. That's my forecast.
Well, among the attendees, I see one of the senior most member of Indian Foreign Service, under whom I have worked, Shyam has worked, many of us worked, Ambassador Eric Gonsalves. Are you there, sir? Ambassador Gonsalves. Okay, I have been seeing the hand from our friend Suresh Goel asking questions. Suresh, go ahead. Suresh, are you there?
Yes,
I see the hand, then people. Okay, I see the former Vice Chancellor of Delhi University, Professor Deepak Pental. Okay, I think the last question I give to my friend who come always to all my functions, my friend from Iceland. Ambassador, go ahead.
Thank you again, and thank you all of you for another stimulating debate. If there's anything that I learned from my 12 years in India, is that it's very hard for amateurs to understand this very complex society, and that applies also in India's relations with other countries. And one thing that we can all be glad for is that we are now no longer run by amateurs in Washington, and how that plays out with in India. U.S. relations, we'll have to see, but certainly we won't see the type of any type of knee-jerk reactions, including on the issues raised by Suhasini just now, and all of you discussed. But I would add one element that the professionals who are now again in charge of the foreign policy in the U.S. will certainly appreciate India as a partner in international affairs, whether it's regional or multilateral, and that I think is a good contribution to be made in the future.
Thank you all. I think we have already overspent 10, 12 minutes. I thank all the panelists, Ram Madhavji, Shyam, Raja Mohanji, Professor Chintamani, short duration, and those who asked questions. I think we have touched some point. This is just a discussion just barely 7-8 days after the new administration come into office. We will have a lot more things to discuss when we have another round of session, maybe after 3 months. Thank you all. And also, I would like to thank my friends who have joined from abroad. I see some friends from Chicago, Puneet from New York, then I have Amitabh Banerjee from London, and some other all friends. So time zones, a different time zone, they have taken trouble of joining. Thank you all. Have a nice evening. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
One round of applause to all.
Thank you. Thank you.
Appreciation for Sri Sundar Kumar ji. Thank you very much.